You
On
go.
camera. There
All
we go.
right.
Yeah.
All right.
All
Welcome.
right, now I'm a
welcome.
technical genius.
You've done it. You've joined us. Welcome to the Pangburn Discord. Welcome to the Pangburn Discord, and welcome to everyone else if you haven't joined us before. This is Dr. Stephen Hicks. I'm going to let him actually introduce himself to the audience really quickly. If you could kind of give us a broad overview of who you are, what you do, and why it is you do what you do. Just kind of a broad sense of things.
Okay, we're jumping in now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Jump straight into it.
I was just going to let you know real quick. If Tart didn't tell you, we're a very informal community. We're just hanging out, so don't feel pressured. We don't have any huge agenda or anything. We're just here having a good dialectic, good conversation. So don't feel pressured.
Good. All right. Well, I'm a professor of philosophy at Rockford University in Illinois, Chicagoland. We're a small liberal arts university, so we keep our classes small, and which means lots of access to the professors and lots of writing and in-person communication. I'm originally from Toronto, but I grew up in Canada, came to the States for grad school, and this is where I've made my career. Now, why I do philosophy? Well, I'm interested.
That's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah. Philosophy gradually became more interesting to me when I realized that it's, in a way, the mother science, that you get your basic views on the nature of the world, human beings, values, how we should organize ourselves socially, how we're going to form our beliefs, and that informs pretty much everything that one does as a human being in life. Has huge implications. And as a kid, I always loved reading and was interested in just about everything. So philosophy came to be a natural fit.
Excellent.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, you're going to get along really well with our community here. Like having those smaller classes and having the more interactive approach is kind of what we're all about. Offering that kind of an experience to everyone. Now, tell me about your philosophical works and positions. What are the sort of things that you tend to focus on, and how you go about getting to those conclusions?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm old enough now that when I look back on my career, it seems to fall into 7-year chunks where I get interested in a topic and I read a lot about it. I'll write some shorter pieces, articles, reviews, and then teach courses in that area for 5 years, and then the next 2 years are writing and getting a book published. And then I'm on to the next thing, whatever that happens to be. So I think I'm up to 6 books now. I don't know if the math quite works out, but...
We will be plugging your books at the end of this episode, by the way.
Yeah.
We'll plug all your stuff.
Yeah, so my first book largely came out of my PhD work, was mostly in theory of knowledge, kind of cognition issues, epistemology, logic, foundations of knowledge. I did a critical thinking textbook. The next book was on postmodernism, which I became interested in once I started teaching at my university. I was teaching team teaching courses in our honors program, which meant I was paired up with professors from literature and history and anthropology and economics and so on. And many of them were quite into postmodern authors whom I'd had kind of a glancing acquaintance with as an undergraduate, but I'd not focused on them for grad school because I was doing quite a narrower philosophy, more in the analytic or Anglo-American tradition. So I got up to speed on a lot of the postmoderns and wrote a book called Explaining Postmodernism, which was my next one. I got very interested in political history. I've always had a long-standing interest in the kind of the big disasters of modern political history, primarily being National Socialism and International Socialism, better known as communism. And certainly I was growing up in the 20th century. Cold War was a part of my cultural horizon. And for my parents' generation, World War II, and my grandparents' generation, the big battle against National Socialism, and of course Italian, or sorry, not Italian, I was thinking actually of the Japanese front as well, another kind of authoritarianism, but they were formerly allied with the Italian fascists and the German National Socialists. Point being that all of that political history was interesting to me, but at the same time, I was very interested in the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who,
Right.
again, I was doing reading, really is perhaps the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. He died in 1900, but his influence over the course of the 20th century.
Yeah, his sister published all of his works, is that right?
No, that's not quite true. We can come back to that detail. It's an interesting
Sure.
But what was fascinating to me was that Nietzsche was a great influence on the National Socialists. So both the political leaders, people like Goebbels and Hitler himself, but also the theorists of National Socialism, many of whom had PhDs in philosophy and in legal theory and so on. And they were largely influenced by Nietzsche. And Martin Heidegger joined the Nazi Party, and he was an amazingly important philosopher. Anyway, this connection between Friedrich Nietzsche and his views and his influence on the Nazis was very important to me and interesting to me. So I wrote a book on that subject as well. Since then, I've been interested in philosophy of education, and I've been doing quite a bit of work on how different philosophies of education have different assumptions about what it is to be a human being, what the important values are, predict very different curricula, very different methodology, very different kinds of teachers one's going to hire. And so the 20th century and now into the 21st century has been very experimental, with all kinds of different kinds of schools being tried out, sometimes within the public school penumbra, but often in private schooling and homeschooling and so on. So I've been, again, very interested in the connection between abstract philosophy and, in this case, very down-to-earth, practical, how do we raise kids to be functioning adults in the real world, whatever we take being a functioning adult in the real world to be. So, and then there have, of course, been some other projects along the way, but I'll stop with those ones.
That gives us a good survey of views. I'm curious about, so you talk a lot about Nietzsche and the Nazis and those sorts of things. And I do want to keep this at an academic level, but to briefly summarize, what do you think the relationship was there? I know that the Nazis have been criticized as sort of misinterpreting and misunderstanding Nietzsche's views, and some people have said that the connection is not justified. What's your view on that?
My view is a split decision. There are lots of ways, and important ways, in which Friedrich Nietzsche would have been disgusted by the Nazis in particular. So, for example, Nietzsche had some anti-Semitism in his views. He was a 19th century German, and it was kind of everywhere in the culture, but it's a kind of a low-grade anti-Semitism. And in many respects, he's highly admiring of the Jews and what they've been able to accomplish culturally, intellectually, and so on. So the very virulent anti-Semitism that is an official part of Nazism would have been disgusting to him. And even in his own generation, he was intellectually active in the 70s, 80s. This is the 19th century. He was disgusted by the anti-Semites of his generation. So that's one important difference there. Mm-hmm. The Germans also were strongly nationalistic, the Nazis were strongly nationalistic, arguing that the Germans were kind of God's gift to the universe, and it was going through the Germans that the world is going to go on its world historical destiny. And Nietzsche was, again, rather disgusted by the state of German culture in the 19th century. So he thought perhaps back in the late medieval ages, the Germans were something significant and to be feared and had some sort of cultural, admirably deep traits, but that they had declined. And from his perspective, the widespread embrace of socialism and all of the religious revivalism, even the interest in democracy, the idea that everybody is equal and should have political power, he was disgusted by all of that, and he saw Germany as largely culturally and intellectually buying into that. But at the same time, then I want to go to the other side. I want to say that the Nazis were bang on accurate in seeing Nietzsche as one of their intellectual forerunners, that they did not misinterpret some of the very important themes, that Nietzsche is indeed, if not, one of the fathers, perhaps one of the grandfathers of National Socialism. So, for example, one of the big divides in philosophy and political culture at that time is this is over, say, the status of war and peace. Do we think that human beings are progressing the way the classical liberals were arguing at the time toward putting our predatory, barbarian, let's fight over natural resources and other kinds of status issues, and becoming respectful of individuals, respectful of universal rights, that we are going to have kind of democratic Republican governments that respect everybody's equal rights? Are we going to be kind of free market capitalists of some sort or other?
Right.
We're going to make stuff with each other and trade with each other and become increasingly global citizens of the world. So that progressive, classical, liberal, pro-market vision was very strong in the 19th century, and Nietzsche had nothing but disdain for that view of the world, that is going to turn us into kind of egalitarian people who just want to be peaceful, and run our dad's hardware shop and get along with our neighbors and so forth, that's really a culture of sheep. Or it's a culture not of anything that's going to make manly men into the kind of men that can be admirable. So Nietzsche subscribes to a very deep, predatory, exploitative, conflict-driven understanding of human relations. So this notion of power and the will to power and the will to dominance, he believes is fundamental not only to kind of all organisms, but certainly to human beings as well. And that as individuals, as cultures, and as a species, we have to kind of channel our aggressive, exploitative instincts. And this is necessarily going to put us not only in conflict with ourselves, but conflict with other people in our society and conflict with other nations who are on different trajectories. So all of that, of course, is music to the ears of the Nazis, and they can take those very general themes and say, we are just kind of repurposing them for our generation. So on that point and on several others, the Nazis, I think, were exactly right in seeing Nietzsche as one of their forerunners. At the same time, don't forget there are some other ways in which Nietzsche would have disapproved of some of the particular policies and even some of the more general themes that the Nazis stood for.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Okay, so you kind of touched on considerations around like egalitarianism and those sorts of things, and the sort of disdain that Hegel had around those views. I'm curious because I've been characterized as a kind of a descendant in thought of someone like Ayn Rand, who was like an egoist. How do you would you think that would you agree with Nietzsche on that, or Rand, or how do you sort of characterize your own views on like our ethical responsibilities and those sorts of things?
Yeah. That's interesting. I wrote a nice long paper for Journal of Ayn Rand Studies called "The Egoism in Nietzsche and Rand," taking up exactly this issue, and it's a fascinating issue. One of the core issues in moral philosophy is, of course, the relationship between the self and others, or between me and you. How are we going to characterize this relationship? And in their robust form, advocates of egoism say each of us should see ourselves as our top values. Your life is yours, my life is mine. Your goals, your self-realization, your happiness should be top value for you, and the same thing for me. By contrast, those who subscribe to a strong form of altruism And here the Latin root is the word alter, which means other. And anytime you put an ism at the end of something, egoism or pragmatism or Nietzscheanism, you're turning that into an explicit set of principles. So what alterists want to argue is that other people should be your top value, that in some sense you are subordinate to or less than those others. So we have a debate over whether for us to be moral individuals, we should put our own values first, or if we should put the values of others first. So, and then there's a long debate in moral philosophy over that debate. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at Ayn Rand's critiques of altruism, and she was very, explicitly hostile to all forms of altruism as an ethic. And you look at Nietzsche's criticisms of altruism, there's very much overlap between the two critiques. Both of them are anti-altruistic. They don't believe that any of us should see other people as more important than ourselves. For both of them, being selfless, saying, taking that literally, self is of less importance, that I should see my life as less important than your life. You should see your life as less important than my life, that is a moral perversion. So they are both agreeing with that, and Nietzsche is very good at exploring the psychological implications for that. Rand tends to focus more on the philosophical implications of that. So, but then if we turn to the positive side, so then we say, all right, we're not going to be altruistic. We're going to say individuals are individuals, or individuals should see themselves as their top value. What is it to be an individualist? What does it mean to see yourself as your top value and to act on that? And their views are almost entirely opposite to each other. And it's very striking. So if you then want to say, what is, for example, this self that you are going to say is most important? And for Rand, the self is, your obviously your physical being and your consciousness. But the most important thing for Rand is that we are rational animals. She's in the Aristotelian philosophical tradition that way. So if you are going to be true to yourself, what that means is being committed first and foremost to developing your rational capacity, for understanding the world, for gathering as many facts as you can, so that you can then take responsibility for your life and you can be a productive person. And all of her, this in her novels, she's very enamored with people who are creative and productive and able to make not only interesting things, but beautiful things and things that enable them to become rich in a free market. So you are going to be a rational individual, you're going to be self-responsible, you are going to be a productive person who makes his or her own way in the world. And then at the same time, she wants to argue that you should respect that other people have their own lives to live, and that they are rational, and you need to respect their right to make their own decisions for their life and to become the world. So for her, her primary social principle comes to be what she calls the trader principle. We should be trading with each other. The idea that I'm going to try to get you to support me in some way, right? Or that I'm going to see you as a potential victim and try to take stuff from you. Both of those alternatives she rejects. Instead, people should be productive and trade with each other. So in that sense, she is a liberal, believing in individuals as rational, responsible, as having equal rights to freedom and the equal rights to whatever property they are able to produce by their own efforts. And she's an advocate of and some sort of free market capitalism. Now, Nietzsche, by contrast, rejects every single word that I just said. He does not believe that individuals are rational beings. Instead, what he wants to argue is that we are creatures of instinct. It's interesting to observe the dates here. Charles Darwin, for example, published his Origin of Species in 1859. Nietzsche was 15 years old at that point, and he was a brilliant teenager, one of these kind of off-the-charts prodigy people reading everything, extraordinarily smart. So and one of the important things about Nietzschean philosophy is that it's the first philosophy to say, what should we do as philosophers if we're going to take seriously the idea that human beings have evolved out of the slime, out of the ooze, out of the nature red in tooth and claws, that that we are first for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, creatures of instinct, the sex drive, and that human beings have been predators, killing and each other, and of course killing other animals in order to survive. So what Nietzsche wants to argue is that we are first and foremost creatures of instinct. And that power is the fundamental value. That what we call our rationality is just this Johnny-come-lately faculty that mostly serves to rationalize after the fact things that we've decided that we want, values that we have on a non-rational, instinctual, biological basis. So he's not at all an advocate of reason. Instead, he tends to think of our rational capacity as something, the world is ugly and messy and full of conflict and aggression and pain and suffering, that what we mostly use our reason for is to try to make the world tidy and organized, give ourselves this psychological illusion that we understand what's going on, and then that the world is this benevolent place. Instead of believing that human beings are productive and should be trading with each other, Nietzsche is fully an advocate of exploitation. He talks a lot about slavery, and sometimes he talks about slavery in a more metaphorical context, but he's also completely fine with slavery in a literal context. He has no moral objections whatsoever to slavery. He doesn't believe in. He doesn't say these things very developedly, but he's opposed to free market capitalism. He's opposed. He has this ongoing line that we should let people make their own individual choices. When it comes to breeding and marriage. On kind of evolutionary grounds, farmers don't let just their animals, males and females, breed in a willy-nilly fashion. If we're really concerned with improving the species, improving whatever species we're interested in, we have selective breeding, and Nietzsche wants to apply that also to marriage as well. Interestingly, another connection to later eugenics movements that the Nazis picked up, right, and so on. The point is going to be, I can give you the link to the article, but pretty much every single point in terms of what counts as an advocacy of egoism, what the self is, and what kinds of actions one should engage in to realize oneself, Rand and Nietzsche are entirely opposed to each other.
I'm curious at the meta-ethical level. So how do you take this to be, with respect to Rand, Nietzsche, or yourself even, I'm curious, do you take ethics to be a realist view, or do you take this to be like an anti-realist view? Like, are the sort of normative properties, like the moral properties, are those made true by the agent's attitudes, like by the ego, or is it made true by some other facts? Is there something else to it?
Yeah, that terminology gets slippery very quickly. So let me just say, in a generic sense, I am a moral realist. So that is to say, I think that morality is a kind of science, if we use the epistemological label, but that it's picking out facts about the world. And let me just say, just in a couple of examples about that. So I don't think it has... that we attitudinally, we make a kind of commitment to certain things and thereby create goodness, or at least an attitude with respect to goodness. So examples I like to use is, suppose we're not talking about human beings for a moment, because human beings are complicated, but if we suppose we're biologists, and we are, from an external perspective, we're studying some other species. So I don't know. Let's just pick a species. Suppose I don't know. I saw a red-tailed hawk flying out my window just a little while ago. So suppose I'm interested in studying this hawk, and I say, so I observe the hawk, and I say, I start to acquire some scientific knowledge about what the hawk is. I see that it has wings so it can fly, that it has very good eyesight so it can see at a distance, that it has its talons that seem to be very good at tearing flesh apart and grabbing things, and it has a beak, and I could study it more closely and come to learn about what its nutritional needs are and so on. So all of this so far, what we are doing is biological science. We're describing red-tailed hawk in terms of its needs and its capacities. And nothing of this has anything to do with my attitudes or even the hawk's attitudes. So we say the red-tailed hawk is a species of a certain sort. It has a certain biological nature, and part of that biological nature is that it has certain kinds of needs and certain kinds of capacities. Now, suppose I then notice that this red-tailed hawk, and last year I saw this because there are some rabbits in a field next to me, succeeded in catching a baby rabbit, a young rabbit that was not very savvy, right, at that point. So it was quite striking. It swooped down, it grabbed the rabbit, and presumably it took the rabbit off, and the rabbit became lunch or whatever. And so then I might study this and say things like the rabbit is a source of food for the hawk. And so what I would say is the hawk has certain needs, and it has certain capacities for observing, for flying, for catching, and it performed those actions, and it caught the baby rabbit, it took it, then it dismembered the baby rabbit, and it ate baby rabbit. Now, so far, I am just doing purely descriptive language, right? I'm not introduced a single normative concept or said anything about good or bad. What I want to argue, though, and this is where the moral realism is coming in, is that the moral concepts, actually, moral is too strong here, the normative concepts at this point follow very easily from these scientific descriptive concepts. From the perspective of the hawk, it makes sense to say that rabbits are good for hawks. Let me just say, does that compute or not? Am I just
No, I understand normatively.
Okay. Now we have introduced a normative context. What does that mean, though? It's got nothing to do with any sort of emotionalist reaction that I have or any sort of attitudinal projection. I'm not getting divine commandments from a god in the sky. What I am saying when I say rabbits are good for hawks is a relational fact. Rabbits have a certain biological constitution. They're made up of certain things, proteins and fats, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And there is a fit between the biological constitution of the rabbit and the biological needs of the hawk. That the rabbit meat satisfies a need of the hawk. And that then is the good. Now, what I'm then saying is there's a relational fact. It's not that there's some intrinsic fact about the rabbit or some intrinsic fact about the hawk, but rather there's a relationship between facts about both the hawk and the rabbit. It would also make sense then to say that having feathers and knowing how to fly is good for the hawk. I can also flip that out. If I were to take the hawk and start plucking its feathers out, you would say that is bad for the hawk. And what we mean by saying that it's bad for the hawk is to say that the hawk has a natural capacity, flying, and that flying is good for the hawk because it enables it to catch the rabbit that it needs for food. And so thereby, if I'm plucking the feathers out of the hawk, that's bad because it is undermining the hawk's capacity to satisfy its needs. Okay. So now this is just one example to work out, but the idea is that you start from a number of facts about the world, and there are, because of the nature of biological organisms, relational facts. Right, about their needs, about their capacities, about the kinds of actions, about the kinds of things that are out there in the environment that are good for them, and that ethics as a science starts there. So we are introducing then concepts of ethics and morality or normative concepts by piggybacking them on scientific facts about the world. And then the story just gets more complicated depending on what kind of a species you are talking about, and human beings are much more complicated than hawks and rabbits, so the story will get more complicated. But that's how I would start the moral realist story.
With that in mind, one criticism I could imagine is something like a response from Hume, where it seems like you're taking descriptive facts and then deriving from those descriptive facts the normative facts. Would you respond that you aren't doing that, or would you have a criticism of whether or not that's even like a great criticism of your view?
No, that's exactly the right point to say, right? Hume wants to argue there's a divorce in principle between descriptive and normative. I'm saying that Hume is wrong, right? Right? That normative. But what I'm saying is not that there are descriptive facts, and then there's this other category of things that we call normative statements. What I want to say is that normative statements are a type of descriptive fact. What I mean by saying, right, that we just backtrack a little bit here, because the way Hume sets up his argument is he wants to say, all right, so you have this descriptive fact, and you have this other descriptive fact, but when I look, I don't see like any sort of little flag that pops up that is normativity, right, or goodness, right, or badness. So he's looking for some like additional property. So it's yellow, it's heavy, it smells a certain way. I want some other property that I can sense that is going to be a moral property. And I don't see any of those sorts of things, so I guess they don't exist. What I want to argue is that the normative claim is a network of descriptive claims. It's a relational descriptive claim. And that normative concept is that network of descriptive claims.
Okay, I want to touch on one more subject before we open up, because I do want to give the audience the opportunity to also interact with and ask some questions of their own. I want to touch on some postmodernist stuff, and then following that, we'll go ahead and open up to the audience. Just a couple of quick announcements while we're at a little break here. So Travis Pangburn is going to be with Lawrence Krauss in Vancouver on October 13th, discussing his new book, The Age of Knowledge. He wants to encourage everyone, join the YouTube as well. If you are watching on YouTube currently, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to those and answer. Have those be asked to Dr. Hicks as well. If you're in the Discord channel and you would like to also ask a question, feel free to post in our chat section that you'd like to raise your hand, and we'll go ahead and call on you guys in order. So back to the postmodernist question. I think this is probably the area that most of the Pangburn audience will be most interested in, is kind of knowing your criticisms of postmodernism. What are those criticisms, and how would you respond to those who have responded to you? Because I know you've had a lot of works on these, so we might be switching gears pretty fast here, but I just wanted to ask quickly about that.
Oh my goodness, that's impossible. A network of things.
Wow.
What are my criticisms of postmodernism? First, we have to say what postmodernism is, but in order to explain postmodernism, we have to explain modernism, because postmodernism is a rejection of modernism.
Right.
My criticisms, and then people who criticize me. Okay, so how many weeks are we going to be here?
No, you can take as long as you want to. We can, you know, if people are enjoying this, we can all night. Doesn't matter. But go ahead. Please elaborate.
I can say some general things, of course, but is there anything specific that you want to make sure I touch on, or should I just launch in?
No, feel free, just launch in. You can define modernism, what postmodernism it is, and what sort of issues you think postmodernism has. Okay,
so postmodernism is a philosophy. It's a negative philosophy, but as a philosophy, that means you need to talk about at least 4 or 5 major sub-issues. So, what's the nature of reality? What is it to be a human being? What is the nature of the good, right, or values? How should we interact with each other socially? What should our social and political principles be? And then all of the cognitive issues, and any of the answers you're going to give to all of those kinds of questions. How do you know what really counts as knowledge. So all of those things need to be addressed to have a complete philosophy. We might also argue that aesthetics is a part of philosophy, given the importance of art to human existence. So we might then say there's a sixth question there. So if you are going to define any comprehensive philosophy, you have to say something about its metaphysics, its views of knowledge, its views of human nature, its value theory, its social political theory, and possibly its ethics. Okay, so what modernism then represents is a philosophical package and that's a school of people who more or less agree on a certain set of claims in that area, and then postmodernism, which is going to be a rejection of all of those claims in a claim that we then need to go past modernism, or we need to go in a completely different direction now that we have rejected modernism. Now, the part of the complexity here is not only that there's all of these philosophical issues, but that this is also partly a historical claim. So what the postmoderns are doing is saying that the modern world, by which they mean the last really 500 years or so, the core ideas that have animated the modern world and the institutions that have come into existence based on those ideas, all of that is a mistake. So to boil all of this down, I'm going to take just one claim. So we get the name postmodernism, at least in philosophy, from Jean-Francois Lyotard, who speaks of the postmodern condition. That was one of his phrases. And then when at a point he's asked to define what he means by the postmodern condition, he puts out this phrase that everybody latches onto, and I think it's a very good descriptive, right, where he says, postmodernism fundamentally means skepticism towards meta-narratives. So let's take that as a starting point. Now the point here is going to be skepticism, which is the view that we don't have knowledge, we never have certainty. In fact, all we have are beliefs that we may be more or less committed to, but that any sort of success concept about cognition, that we have truth, that we have knowledge, that we have certainty, that we have high probability, that something is beyond the shadow of a doubt or whatever, say in a legal context, that all of that is faulty, is to be exploded. We don't have knowledge, we don't have certainty, we don't have truth, we don't have anything that counts as beyond a reasonable doubt, and so on. Now, the other part of that is to say the skepticism towards meta-narratives. And if we take that part, now a narrative is a story that we tell. And it's interesting that the postmoderns will speak a lot about narratives. And the word narrative, of course, comes out of the world of fiction. We're not talking about hypotheses or theories or truths in a more scientific way. Instead, we're talking about the stories that we make up, the stories that we tell ourselves. And a meta-narrative is going to be kind of a big picture story. So when we step back from all of the little stories we tell, we're looking for kind of the big theory or the big story that's going to tell us everything, or the big picture about the world, that we've got it all basically worked out in our scientific theory or a religious theory or whatever it is. So what postmodernism then is in this formulation is the idea that any big picture story we want to tell about the nature of reality, about the human condition, postmodernism is on principle skeptical towards that. And the postmoderns, the most prominent of them, are all very philosophical individuals. So the ones that I focus on are the ones who I think of are the big four, the big brains. In the 1950s, they were all getting their PhDs. In the 1960s, they were all becoming famous and well-known in the profession. Deservedly so, given the power of their ideas. So Lyotard, whom I mentioned, but Michel Foucault, Richard Rorty, Jacques Derrida, and deconstruction is the label there. But the point that all of them are making is that the modern world was not skeptical. It thought that we could be rational, we could acquire knowledge, In some cases, if we develop very sophisticated mathematical and logical and statistical tools, and we did the experiments very carefully, we could acquire certainty. And we could do so in an increasing way to figure out more and more about the world. That we could ultimately come up with a network of theories that are in principle going to explain everything. Now, we're not there yet because the world is complicated, but it's this very progressive, anti-skeptical. In fact, we do have methods of observation and concept formation and logic and mathematics and scientific method to figure out truths, objective truths about the way the world works, and so we can come up with what we call knowledge. Now, all of that came out of a philosophy that was developed in the early modern world and developed in increasing sophistication. The postmoderns are all of a generation in the 1950s, kind of after World War II, and the world is picking itself up again intellectually, that is very skeptical. That there have been a lot of effort directed toward developing skeptical arguments about kind of all of the elements of cognition, about perception, about logic, about math, about scientific method, et cetera, and all of that came together as philosophy was at a very skeptical place in the 1950s. It was a sophisticated skeptical place, kind of the state-of-the-art skepticism. This is also partly the way philosophy goes. It tends to go in more or less skeptical and optimistic phases over the course of its lifetime.
Right.
Postmodernism was born of this deep skepticism that took hold of the profession in the 1950s. And it wasn't just in the Anglo-American philosophical world. Logical positivism was very popular, but it had ultimately reached a conclusion that we can't know anything about values, about the nature of reality, and so forth. And so that paradigm had collapsed. Pragmatism had been a kind of retreat from the optimism of modernity. But by the time we get into neo-pragmatism and then neo-pragmatism of Quine and Richard Rorty, it's becoming increasingly skeptical as well. But if we jump across the ocean to Europe, the big sexy philosophies are existentialism, for example. And existentialism is saying, well, there's probably no God, and we're alone in this alien universe, and we can't know if there's a right way to live. And we can't trust the religious authorities. We can't trust the scientific authorities. So all we can do is make these subjective commitments into whatever values. So the point just is going to be that in the 50s, philosophy is at a very skeptical moment, and the postmodern philosophers are getting first-rate PhDs in philosophy, and they're very sophisticated at every single important skeptical argument. What they're then wanting to argue is that if we now think these optimistic aspirations of modern philosophy, reason and observation and science and careful thinking, we can acquire truth. If we don't believe any of that, what are we going to do? What should philosophy look like? What does this imply for religion? What does it imply for my personal life? What does it imply for social life? What does it imply for politics? And postmodernism then is a working out of this very skeptical philosophical approach. So that's one important thread. So I'll just pause at that moment in case you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I actually think that you've kind of given a really broad overview of everything. I think the probably the most pressing question is, in your academic works, some have said that you either misrepresented or overgeneralized things regarding postmodernism. I'm sure you've given some rebuttals back to those kind of concerns, but I'd be curious what do you say to your opposition on this? If they say, I know that my question specifically was a very general question, so into this context, it totally makes sense to have a very general answer. But if they're saying, hey, it's overgeneralized, how do you respond to that? What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to pull professional rank here, but what I've noticed in the criticism is there's criticisms that come from professional philosophers. There's criticisms that come from academics who are not philosophers. They might be very smart and good in their discipline. And then there are criticisms that come from people who are amateurs, and there can be very, very good amateurs. They are not yet quite at a professional level. Might be well-read in particular things as well. So I get three categories of criticisms. Now, what I want to say, though, is the philosophers. There have been, to my knowledge, 9 formal reviews, right, of my work on postmodernism, published in journals by professional philosophers. And by and large, the philosophers are on board with my understanding of what postmodernism is. Now, I give some really broad targets. I make some interpretations about Kant. And there are always, on Kant scholarship, lots of debates back and forth about particular details. I have things to say about Nietzsche, about Heidegger, and of course about Foucault, Derrida, Rorty, and so on. So in my book, I go through, I think it's about 32 important thinkers in the lead up to postmodernism. So there always are going to be particular things that you can criticize me, because all of those philosophers are schools of interpretation that disagree with each other, and I take a stance on each of those. So, but all of that is kind of normal for philosophy, but overall, the philosophers seem to be saying, I got Kant basically right, I got Marx basically right, I got Nietzsche basically right, I got Heidegger basically right, and so forth. So, and I've responded on some of those particular issues. Now, the criticisms that come from the non-philosophers, these are going to be people who have PhDs, say in sociology or in anthropology or in history. So they're going to be very well read in their field. And almost always the criticisms, though, are coming from people who are postmodern friendly, but they are not philosophy PhDs. I don't know of any philosophy PhDs who are postmodernists who have responded to my book. There's been a kind of a silence in that quarter. Instead, the criticisms that I'm aware of come from sociologists and historians and some critical race theorists and so forth. So in many cases, what they will do, though, is focus not on the epistemological issues that I was just talking about at some length 5 minutes ago. There's another important thread where postmodernism incorporates a social theory, a value theory, and a politics. And almost always, those critics, they like the politics of postmodernism, and I am strongly critical of the politics of postmodernism. So primarily, what we have then is people who don't like the criticisms of the politics, and what's more important to them is to defend the politics and not so much the postmodern philosophical framework that is being used to develop the politics. So there we're just getting into kind of standard debates. But it's very difficult when you are arguing with people who are coming from a philosophically postmodern perspective, because there are huge methodological divides. If you, for example, are very skeptical about reason, about logic, about evidence, then what that is going to imply is that you are not going to debate or argue issues the same way that someone who is committed to evidence, reason, and logic is. Part of the postmodern package is to say that what we call knowledge is just our subjective preferences or our group conditioned, whatever our identity network is, group conditioned value and belief system. And what that does is it sets you up for a kind of ad hominem strategy. Anybody who's not in your identity group is seen as having, just fundamentally different outlook on the world, and there is no independent access to the world, no independent evidence, logic. Even what we mean by logic means different things. So you tend to argue past each other, and or one side tends to see language not as a cognitive tool, but more as a rhetorical weapon. You're using language in a way to try to attack people. So the debates typically are not very productive there. And while in many cases these are the non-philosopher academics, they're intelligent people, and so they know, so to speak, enough philosophy to be dangerous. Typically, their arguments on the epistemological issues are not at the first-rate level. They're just kind of taking arguments that they think are going to be rhetorically useful for the strategy. So I found those criticisms to be less satisfactory.
Yeah, I can understand why too.
Awesome. I do think this is a good point.
Let me just say just one more thing, just to make sure that I'm being fair. I want to say in my book, I make at least 100 provocative claims, and that all of them get put together in a network. So part of the ongoing discussion should be criticism and debate about each one of those claims and whether I put them together logically or not. So I do welcome the criticism and the feedback. So I don't want to just dismiss it in any sort of ad hominem way or pull kind of academic rank on anyone.
Right.
I've added.
Awesome. What I was going to say was I actually think that this is a good point because I know the audience is that they really want to interact, and I have one person here that I have invited myself that is kind of critical of random thought, and I think that he's sort of a celebrity himself. He runs a YouTube channel, Perspective Philosophy. I saw him jump in. You don't want to join? He doesn't want to join.
I'm happy to join. I'm not a celebrity. Don't call us a celebrity.
I think you're a celebrity myself. So,
Tart, if I may, real quick, just real fast to the audience. When we start asking questions, guys, let's not try to tell our whole life stories or anything like that. Let's try to keep it to where we're on topic and ask a single question, and let's listen to the answer. Okay, guys, I appreciate that.
And also, any content in the chat section on Discord, keep it to like specific questions for him. If you want to have a back and forth with someone else, feel free to use the YouTube for that. One other announcement: following this discussion, we're also having on Kane Baker. If you guys are familiar with him, he's going to graduate with his PhD in philosophy, and he's a fantastic guy. Thomas is going to be interviewing and discussing with him. It's going to be an open chat, very open forum here. I encourage all of you do join. Also, take the time, go over to the Pangburn YouTube channel and subscribe. Join us on there. Like I said, we have tons of content coming out. We're always having awesome guests on. So I want to go ahead and invite Perspective Philosophy first, and then after, if you talk as long as you'd like, and then once you're done, I'll open it up to the audience and let them also ask some questions. So Perspective Philosophy, what kind of questions do you have?
Hello. First, I'd just like to say, really pleased to meet you, Professor. Really love the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions. I do philosophy myself, so this is a great opportunity. So yeah, I mean, I actually really loved your disposition there, your explication, and I think you explicated your position really nicely and really concisely. I do have some questions though. So I know that from the past when I've watched you're quite critical of Kant, specifically calling him a counter-enlightenment philosopher, or like the beginning of the counter-enlightenment philosophy, which I think you then relate to this movement on to postmodernity. And in relation to this conversation, Tart asked you specifically about how you would ground moral claims, and you said that it was a network, if you will, in relation to of descriptions. Now, it seems to me that there is this sort of issue here where Hume, in the tradition, is wanting to create this divide, specifically, which leads him on to splitting normativity off. He's not just rejecting normativity, but he's wanting to say that what we are talking about as normativity are matters of relations of ideas. They're in our heads. They're what we think are good. And then there are the impressions. Now, I'm just wondering how you managed to, get over that Hume's fork, that unity between, propose a unity, I'm assuming, between a priori, a priori rational constructs and a posteriori, descriptive facts or impressions. I'm just wondering how you're going to put them together first and foremost.
Right. Okay. So we've got Kant, and then we've got Kant in relation to the counter-enlightenment, and we have metaethics, and we have Hume. And then we have two things there. One is his ontology of ideas. Ideas is in our heads, relations to impressions. And then we have the a priori, a posteriori. So that's, I lost count, 5 things.
If you want us to just in general, what's your metaphysics?
Yeah.
Just if in general, what's your metaphysics? Because I think that your metaphysics and epistemology. So are you a naive realist? Are you a you clearly don't agree with the postmoderns and those prior to them, that intuition is holding a primary role here. So I'm just wondering how we gain knowledge of the world. Is it just through direct observation?
Okay, so no, I think that's the right place to start, and this is why Kant is important, and the turn there. So I am epistemologically a realist. That is to say, our cognitive faculties, right, our relational capacities put us in contact with reality. So I understand consciousness as a response mechanism to reality. And that what we then need to do, this is why we need to have epistemology as a discipline, is do work to keep our consciousness in connection to reality. Now, we have a very complicated consciousness, so we start with observation. So I am a perceptual realist, not a naive realist. I don't know if there are any naive realists anymore. I don't want to give you a self-congratulatory label, but I'll be a sophisticated realist. And the contrast there is to say I'm rejecting representationalism in perception, the idea that when we are observing or we are using our perceptual faculty, what happens is, this is the representationalist position, that our sense organs are stimulated, and then somewhere back in our brain or in our mind, representations are created, and then our minds then inspect those representations. That road, and Kant is sort of in that area, we have to get specific pretty quickly, is it's the fork in the road, and that's the big problematic view with respect to perception, because once you say the mind is just inspecting representations that are inside the subject's head, and you're stuck, right? There really is no way to get outside of your head to see if the representations have anything to do with reality. So I'm a direct realist in the sense of saying that our perceptual capacities are directly responding to real phenomenon in reality. So on the basis of our perceptions, of course, we can then retain those in memory, and we can hold them, right, in our minds for consideration. And on the basis of that, we go on to form abstract concepts. And then if we do that well, we take those concepts and we start putting them together in more complicated constructions, sentences, propositions. And we develop tools like grammar to help us do that well. And we take those propositions, we put them together in more complicated structures, and then we start talking about narratives and theory. So it's a constructionistic, but it is tied to observation or perception being a direct contact with reality. And that's going to be the big divide then with Kant, because Kant wants to argue in principle that there is a divorce between our perceptual, if we stick with this language so far, Kant has his own terminology, between what we are aware of perceptually and what reality is really in itself. And as a matter of principle, there is no way to bridge the gulf between the perceptual reality, which is just a set of representations inside the subject, and any sort of object of reality that is out there. Now,
phenomena, noumena.
That's phenomena noumena, yes, to introduce the new language. So what he wants to argue is that phenomena, it's the phenomena that our minds are aware of, this is the controversial interpretive move, they are a subjective construct. So he wants to say, for example, that space and time, we have these inbuilt forms of sensibility, he calls, that are part of our subject, our mental apparatus, that whatever raw material comes in from external reality, the noumenal realm, it gets filtered and constructed into space and time relationships and then presented to our subjective mind. and then various other categories like cause and effect and unity and so forth. So everything is a construct made by our subconscious or the transcendental self, to use his label, and then is presented to our phenomenal self or our phenomenal mind. So that then is to say space is not real, time is not real, cause and effect are not real in any metaphysical sense. Instead, they are all subjective constructs. And on the basis of that, I want to say that's the important turn. And because of the power of Kant's arguments for this, subsequent generations of philosophy have not been able to get outside of that Kantian framework. And so it's been a matter of, over the next generations, 4, 5, 6 generations, working out the implications of this basic Kantian move, and then you end up in a very robust skeptical position, and that's where postmodernism comes from. So I want to argue that Kant is the turn to the counter-enlightenment. In some ways, Kant is an enlightenment figure. He has some enlightenment beliefs, but this is, as the question is rightly pointing out, this is the most fundamental issue in philosophy, and if you are fundamentally a skeptic about knowledge of reality, if fundamentally you are a subjectivist about the status of whatever it is we call knowledge and beliefs, then you are no longer an enlightenment philosopher. That you are taking philosophy rather in a different direction. For those of you who know the label, Kant gives this is called the Copernican turn in philosophy. If you just read one thing, I don't know how philosophical your audience is, but if you haven't read anything by Kant, you're just going to read one thing. What I would recommend is that you read the second preface to his Critique of Pure Reason.
Yeah.
This is his most important book. And the second preface, after he published the first edition, he thought for 6 more years. He had some criticisms. He's writing in a very cumbersome fashion. In many cases, he's publishing these ideas for the first time. So 6 years later, he's coming out with a new edition, but he also writes this preface that is just a beautiful, not very long overview of what his position is, why he's making the arguments he's making, and what he sees as the implications for them. And there he makes this very famous analogy to Copernicus, where he wants to say what he is doing for philosophy is what Copernicus did for astronomy. So Copernicus was, in the early modern world, the first to argue that the Earth is not the center of the universe, so to speak. Rather, the sun is at the center of this system and the Earth is just a satellite. And that's just a huge mental shift. What Kant wants to argue is that up until his era, philosophers had made a fundamental assumption that drove their metaphysics and their epistemology. And that assumption was that objectivity is the goal to be striving for. And objectivity, he characterizes as the idea that our minds, our subject, needs to be responsive to the objects that are out there in reality. So facts are facts, truth is truth, right? Objective reality is what it is, independent of our subjective beliefs about that. And what Kant is wanting to argue is that that assumption has to be rejected. Philosophy cannot be about striving for objectivity. It's impossible. Partly he's convinced by Hume, partly he's convinced by some other skeptical arguments that have been developed, that what we need to do, Kant argues then, is make the opposite assumption, that what we call knowledge or what we call reality that we start coming to be aware with is not a revelation of some objects that are out there really in the world, but rather it is a construct of the subject. And that Copernican turn, or the subjective turn, I argue is of fundamental importance for subsequent philosophy. So that's the Kant part. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, just because, obviously, the depth of this history, as I know that you know, is incredibly robust from Kant onwards. But it seems to me that...
Sorry, just the depth of history?
Sorry, the depth of this history is incredibly robust. Sorry, it's me.
Yes, the depth of the history, yes.
Yes, and in relation to what in what you said, I think you have a good characterization in many ways of what Kant is doing, where there is this intuition in which the subject is constructing the world, at least partially, in relation to something else, which is coming from the noumena, which is allowing the intuition to be mapped onto, producing the phenomena, and then you get this this realm that we live in. But I guess there's two things to really say there. There's the reason that Kant is doing it in relation to Hume, and Hume's rejection that reason can be really found in the world, that these sort of principles of reason or that of cognition are objective in themselves. It seems that Hume sort of calling all that into question. Why should we believe in a mind? Why should we believe in God? Why should we believe in causation? And what Kant is actually trying to do is rescue those things from what seems to be an anti-scientific, anti-Newtonian sort of paradigm coming from a kind of realist tradition. And then there's also the fact that the Kantian tradition, that obviously there was the sort of Schopenhauerian, Nietzschean development from Kant, but parallel to that in German idealism, there was also the Fichtean, Schellian, and Hegelian sort of German idealist tradition, which sought to ground reason, and especially in Hegel, I would argue, I'm a Hegelian, so I'm going to argue that it was that it's about grounding reason and being able to observe objective truth. So I'm just wondering how we would account for how we would account for gaining knowledge directly of reality. Do we gain it? Like, how do we gain these? Like, is there an a priori component in our direct observation? I'm just wondering how that would work.
I think everything you have said is very well said, beautifully said, and an apt characterization. I like especially the point about the richness of the history after Kant. There is this big fork in the road where Schopenhauer, for example, and Nietzsche go off in one direction. If Kant has shown that reason has these severe limitations, then what we should do basically is abandon reason and become irrationalist in various directions. So they go off in that direction. And then, yes, you're right that what you have in Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, and interestingly, they were all contemporaries, all deeply read in Kant, all arguing that Kant has got it basically right. Now, where my first difference would be is to say that, yes, they do talk about reason, they do talk about objectivity, but they have reinterpreted those concepts, and we cannot understand those concepts in any sort of a naturalistic or realistic way. So it's most clear in the case of Fichte and Schelling, where they want to argue for kind of a subjectivity, that what we call the subject is not in any way responsive to an independent reality, but rather the subject is creating all of reality. It was not that Kant took an important step into subjectivity, but he didn't go far enough. That human beings, the subject is not taking unknown noumenal data and then massaging it and constructing it in various ways to create merely this individual subjective reality. And in fact, it's creating all of reality. So in effect, human beings are these kind of godlike creatures that are creating all of reality in themselves. So it's a very robust subjectivism in the next generation, and it's a metaphysical subjectivism. So Schopenhauer and Nietzsche typically are following the epistemological route, right? If reason has been a failure, then we need to be epistemologically irrationalist. What the other guys are doing is following the metaphysical route and taking the subjectivism in a more robust metaphysical fashion. So, but what we then have to do is just be clear on our terminology, because when we are saying reason now, we're not talking about reason in the Aristotelian or the Lockean sense, where it's a faculty of the subject that takes awareness of an independent reality and then performs operations on it according to certain objective principles. That sort of naturalist, objectivist understanding of reason has to be entirely rejected. Instead, it's being replaced by the idea that reason is not this response mechanism, but rather this entirely creative mechanism. So it's a completely different kind of thing. And when we are talking about objectivity, there's a kind of redefinition that has gone on here as well. The old tradition, Aristotelian, Lockean, etc., wants to say by the object we mean things out there in reality that are what they are, independent of the subject. Whereas in this case, what we are calling is the object is something that itself has been first created by the subject. So again,
Right.
we're using two completely different terminological domains. So I think Hegel is hard, Fichte is hard, Schelling is hard to understand, particularly for people who come from the Anglo-American tradition, because they see a lot of these words being used and say, oh, Hegel's in favor of reason, or he's in favor of objectivity and so on. But an important redefinition has occurred. To go back one step in the philosophy, what Kant himself does a kind of redefinition where he wants to say that objectivity, we can use that word, and that's going to be fine, but we're not going to be talking about objectivity as a relationship between a subject and objects out in the world, some sort of positive success relationship. Instead, we're going to call things objective if it is universally subjective. So what Kant wants to argue is all human beings basically have the same transcendental subject, all of the same constituting categorical faculties and the forms of sensibility, that we all are structuring our subjective reality according to those same principles. And so then we can say that it's the same. And so that universality gets redefined as objectivity. So objectivity then comes to be redefined as a kind of intersubjectivity or a universal subjectivity. But again, it's important to be aware of the redefinition or the reconceptualizing of terms. Now, then the tail end of your question then is to say, well, then we're still left with the question, if we're not going to go down this Kantian route or either of the post-Kantian fork in the road directions, then we need to go back and say, kind of where did Kant go wrong? Where did Hegel go, where did Hume go wrong? How can we, in the light of Humean and Kantian objections, and these guys are geniuses, how can we come up with a new positive, naturalist, realist, pro-reason, objectivist, right, understanding of the world? And that, of course, is the project. Now, a couple things I would say here. One is human cognition is extraordinarily difficult. I want to say we are still, to a large extent, in the infancy of understanding human cognition. Right? Psychology as a discipline, as a semi-scientific discipline, is perhaps 1 century old, and that many of these guys, Hume, Kant, and the others, are developing their epistemological theories in the absence of any sort of a scientific understanding of human psychology. They're writing in the 1700s. The very beginnings of psychology is usually dated to around 1900 with Freud, and then the early behaviorists and so on. And we're still working that out. What they knew about neuroscience compared to what we know about neuroscience, what they knew about linguistics compared to what we know about linguistics. And I would still say we are in the early stages of developing cognitive psychology, because it is extraordinarily difficult. So it's natural, I think, along the way for primitive theories of psychology and neuroscience and their understanding of the relationship between brain and mind and body and all of the things that we need to understand, and linguistic theory and so forth, for those primitive theories to have holes in them, and for smart philosophers to adopt some sort of a more primitive understanding of the human psyche and then draw out the negative implications of that. I think that's partly what's going on in the case of Hume and partly what's going on in the case of Locke or of Kant. And I want to say that in part that they're doing so because they are drawing on the end of earlier roads that started with Locke and he had a kind of primitive psychology, and Hume is the end of the road for that more empiricistic approach, and Kant is the end of the road for a more rationalistic approach that had been started with Descartes. So what I would then say in answer to your question is that we have to go back, if we're interested in doing it in the intellectual history route, and have another look at Locke, have another look at Descartes, and try first to figure out what assumptions are they making about human psychology that are going to set up for the clever philosophers working out problematic implications of those that come along a little bit later. I know I'm talking a lot of words here, but one other thing I would say is this distinction between a priori and a posteriori, or between analytic and synthetic. I think those are false dichotomies. I think they are, there's a very good undergraduate way of presenting those that makes it very seductive and easy to understand. But I do think those are false dichotomies. And so once you explode those two dichotomies, and that requires some philosophical work, that's going to be part of what will enable you to avoid this bifurcation that Hume ends up with, between matters of facts and relations of ideas, or between Kant's understanding of, the analytic and the synthetic, and then he recognizes that it's not problematic, so he wants to try to work out this third synthetic a priori category, but that's all driven by his first accepting that there is this fundamental distinction between analytic and synthetic, and I think already we're problematic territory in doing so. So, great questions and a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually a really, really great response. And, I actually agree with a lot of what you said. I think the only thing there's one little disagreement maybe on Hegel does see everything as sort of the subject in some respects, but he sees it as the absolute. So the subject becomes God. And so the relation between the subject and the object become a false dichotomy, if anything. So I think he would actually be agreeing with you if you look back at the relationship between analytic and synthetic, or like a priori and sort of a posteriori, and the relation how they've actually formed. And if you go back to Locke and Descartes, I think you'd actually agree with what you've just said there, which is why you would say the objective and the subjective are actually defined interrelatedly. But I guess that's where I think that it needs to go, in the sense that it needs to even go maybe prior to that, because it seems that the reason that Descartes is even coming around and saying they're having this initial sort of skepticism is this rejection of Aristotelianism, and the fact that this this idea of subject and object, this sort of the definite separation between which was the characteristic of the sort of tradition coming off the rejection of Aristotelianism, where it's like Abelard and Roscelin leading on to Occam and so on, with this nominalist tradition where everything is given through the senses and we are just observing it. And then there also seems to be this exaggerated realism, this Platonic tradition. And it seems like, Descartes going one way, and then your John Locke is although influenced by Descartes, is also going the way of Francis Bacon and, the British thinkers who are more nominalists. So you've got your realists and your nominalists, your exaggerated realists and your nominalists. And it seems in between those two, you do have your Aristotelians who would say, actually, well, wait a minute, there's no reason necessarily to maybe separate these things out, and I would say Hegel's one of them. So do you think that maybe it's the issue that really is causing so much of a problem in relation to not only postmodernism, but perhaps also for the sort of the empiricist tradition that sort of was birthed from nominalism, was this rejection of Aristotelianism in such a way as it led to such led to a false dichotomy?
Yeah, no, I think that, again, that's very well said. The philosophy of history guy in me loves that we keep pushing this further back, and we end up with Aristotle versus Plato again, 2,400 years ago. And of course, we would throw the sophists in as the skeptics, relativists of the generation, to have the trichotomy again. But yes, but I think also partway through your comment, you're putting your finger on one of the important issues, and that's the status of concepts. and nominalism being one of the theories of conceptual formation, and Platonic realism being at the other end, and the Aristotelians trying to work out some sort of middle ground. So we have a trichotomy that's going on there. And this is a deep issue in psychology, in cognition, and in philosophy. So even if we say that we are really in direct observation of reality, so we're doing this virtually, but I'm looking at individual human beings across my screen there, and I'm one of them. And I say, you're this guy, and you're that guy, and you're this other person. If I knew all of your names, and I would describe your physical features. All of those are discrete and particular and individualistic. So suppose we say the success thing about this first stage of human cognition, that I'm actually observing real individuals in the world with their real properties, or whatever that is. We do, as human beings, make this big cognitive move to abstractions, where I say, you are all individuals with all of your particularity, but you're all human beings. I've got this abstract concept, humanity, right? Or being a human being, and it's not identical with the particular traits of any one of you, right? It doesn't have a hair color, and it doesn't have a skin texture, and it doesn't have a name beyond this abstract word label that we have attached to it. So how do we do that? How do we go from supposed real observations to abstract concepts, and say that nonetheless these abstract concepts are objective, in the sense that they are in fact tied to reality? And that is a huge issue that has divided philosophers and other forms of cognition theories, going back to Plato and Aristotle. And most of the theories of concept formation have, over the course of history, of course, had weaknesses in them. Then people can drive various sorts of truck through, and they get exploded, and it's easy to come up with the skeptical arguments as well. So again, I would then say what we need is more sophisticated psychology that started to be developed, and we need to put this to experimental test. What exactly are we doing when we are sorting things into groups based on similarities and differences? How do our minds do this? How do we abstract some things, leave other things behind? How do we describe label or attach labels and so on? And all of that needs to be worked out in a successful way. Just one more thing about the Hegel comment. I think that's also an important one. I guess not quite full circle, but back to the postmoderns. I mentioned Foucault and Rorty and Lyotard and Derrida, and I put them in this broad label that they're all postmoderns, and I make an argument for that. But that's not to say that there aren't differences between them, right? As postmoderns, because in some cases they get to their postmodernism through different routes, and that their postmodernism on secondary and tertiary issues is going to emphasize different sorts of things. So Foucault, for example, is very much about Nietzschean power, right? And so Nietzsche is the more important thinker here. Derrida is very much interested in language and syntax and semantics and structuralist and post-structuralist theories of language and linguistics. So he's coming to his postmodernism through that route. I would say Lyotard, I think, is probably the one who is most influenced by Kant. And when you read through Lyotard, he's very sophisticated in his understanding of Kant and connecting his 20th century postmodernism ultimately to Kantian epistemological moves. But it's very interesting to the case of Rorty, and this is maybe something that will warm your Hegelian heart. Where Rorty wants to say that his neo-pragmatism comes out of pragmatism, but the pragmatism comes ultimately out of Hegel. In his estimation, when you look at how all of these ideas develop out, whatever road you try to travel down to try to get out of the postmodern trap, you're going to end up back at Hegel. And so for him, Hegel really is the most important fork in the road. So it's a slightly post-Kantian generation that he's hearkening to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually really great. I'm going to say one more thing, I think, and then I'll leave it up to everyone else because I don't want to take up too much time. I actually think that was very nicely said, and I think that's it really in terms of how it works. I think with this idea of like, well, there's pragmatism in general. I do actually think pragmatism sees a lot of its heritage in Hegel, and also how it sort of comes back around, because Hegel's not okay with just saying that it has to be pragmatic. It also has to be objective and true. So there is this sort of truth-finding mechanism that is correcting or what is pragmatic, and it's also driving us to also find what is true. So it's this beautiful connection. And I guess that this is what really, I think, as you say, there is this connection between how concept formation, when you observe the world, we talk about these abstracts. We go from these particular in these particular points, and up until the point of Hegel, it seems that everyone is very, very, especially someone like Locke and Descartes and Locke, they're very much interested in how this sort of these abstracts are formed and how we are gaining this. Well, specifically Locke, in terms of how we are building this corpuscular psychology up from what we're observing, and then how that relates to the real world. And then when you get to Hume, it doesn't relate to the real world. He's sort of making that, he's severing it, or there's no reason to believe that it does. And Kant is then trying to sort of he's like, no, we're just gonna push it back in somehow. And I think what Hegel's actually interested in is, okay, from this point of view where we see the particular object and we create these abstract universals, he's also really wanting to sort of turn it on its head and go, what's actually making those particular objects not abstract in themselves? Like, what is grounding them in relation to a rational form of inquiry where I can go, this isn't something like, I'm not hallucinating, I'm not, totally
something
detached
concrete.
from something concrete in itself.
Yeah.
And he wants to sort of flip it on its head and say, now we have this sort of back and forward between universal or abstract and particular. Is this movement it is this movement itself that is helping me construct a rational reality? Do you not think that there has to be, and for that to be the case, necessarily a kind of relationship between our intuitions and, like, as if when our intuition, and not necessarily in a very Kantian sense, but in how we are perceiving reality, we have to acknowledge that, we are psychologically representing reality. And a lot of that actually is a mental process. And we need to take note of that mental process in order to, engage in the kind of deconstruction of that process that we see in something like in the empirical analysis within creating experiments in science.
No, absolutely. I think that's right. We have to understand, particularly past the perceptual level, that the human mind is incredibly active, and it's active according to its nature. So there is something about our brain/mind that enables us to perform certain kind of cognitive operations that other species, as far as we know, cannot do. And we have to go through those processes, and we need to understand what those processes are, how they can go wrong, in order to do it well. And I think I'm going to use slightly different language here, but built into what you were saying is that one of the assumptions of philosophy up until the modern world had been this assumption that the mind cannot have any identity or nature or constitutional faculty of itself, because if it does, that's necessarily going to make cognition important or impossible. So the mind has to be, kind of this lump of plasticine, and reality, and a passive. Reality just kind of stamps itself on it, or that it's receptive of these forms in some way. Aristotle makes this pretty explicit at one point. Plato sort of makes it explicit at various points as well. Locke also, when he's talking about the mind being blank paper, tabula rasa, in that cognitive sense, he's not as extreme on this. There are other places where his psychology is more complicated, but the idea is that you want something that is as passive and as empty as possible so that reality can right itself. And Rorty, in his perhaps most famous book, uses the metaphor of a mirror. That the philosophy in the mirror of nature, so that the mind has to be like a mirror that's just holding itself up to reality and just reflecting in a completely passive, unactive way what's going on out there in reality. Now, part of then, I think, good philosophy, and this is to get past any sort of naive realism, is to realize that that is an absolutely impossible psychology to start with, right? That what we call the brain and the nervous system that it's integrated with, and all of the psychological operations come from our beings that have a certain nature or a certain identity, that we interact with reality a certain way, and understanding what that way is exactly what the science of cognition ultimately all has to be about. There's it's kind of a slightly sideways connection here, that part of the history of philosophy and the history of religion have an interesting intersection at this point, where if you look at religious epistemologies and what counts as knowledge in that case, in this case, or the best kind of knowledge, ultimately has been a kind of a mystical revelation, or in some sense, the person who's the prophet or the mystic is going to receive this knowledge, isn't making it up, isn't engaging in any sort of particular cognitive apparatus. Instead, God, or the God, whichever one we are talking about, is the being that has the knowledge and just slams it, right, or in some sort of revelation, implants it, fully formed, into the mind of the mystic, or into the prophet. And that's what knowledge is. And so you are to try to make yourself as empty as you possibly can through meditation and fasting, right, or whatever, to become this empty vessel into which the gods are going to just pour knowledge in. So that's to push religious epistemology in a certain direction. But that model of mind does get carried over into some more secular attempts to understand what epistemology is, and I think that as a starting assumption is going to be faulty.
Gotcha.
That was brilliant. I'll sort of step back now and let you get on. But that was really interesting. I actually really liked that, and I didn't really get on
good
too much.
Observations and questions, so we could turn this into a really good seminar.
Thank you very much. But yeah, I thought that was really good, and I hope you have a nice day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Perspective Philosophy. That was really entertaining to hear the back and forth there. I'd ask him here because I knew it was going to be good, but that was awesome.
Yeah.
We do have some questions coming in from the audience. So we've got a few audience members that are that in the background, they've been asking some questions. I'm going to go ahead and calling them on the mic and letting them ask their questions about this. Also, just to re-announce, if you're watching on YouTube, please take the time, like and subscribe. We have content like this coming out all the time. Also, feel free to join the Discord server. Travis also wanted me to let everyone know he's going to be on the stage in Vancouver with Lawrence Krauss on October 13th, discussing Lawrence's book, The Age of Knowledge. If you're interested in that, you're welcome to take a look on his website for that one. Then also, I got Bruce, who was supposed to be my other...
sorry I'm late. Very sorry.
He showed up, so he's here. He also has questions, I believe. I'm going to let him do that as well. And then one other thing, we have Kane B coming on right afterwards.
That's right. I was going to say real quick, we got about 30 minutes left, and then Kane will be on. But I mean, anybody can stay that wants to stay. Kane can just join in, and we can continue on with the conversation. So no one will feel
for a quick moment here.
Having fun
going for about an hour.
No, Nivik, hold on, Nivik.
I just want to say we've been going for about an hour and a half, and this is fun, but I do have a hard stop at my 6:45.
Okay.
17 minutes from now, just so we know.
Okay. Yeah, let's get a couple of questions in from some people. Remember, guys, make it one question, and let's hear the answer, okay?
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I was supposed to be on the co-host of this. It's somewhat apropos. It is the Lord's Day, so I was very busy. But it's it comes right on the heels of what you were discussing right before this in the revelational epistemology. And so I just want to say, first of all, it's wonderful to meet you. I've read quite a few of your books.
Thank you.
And most recently, the Exploring Postmodernism. And I also enjoyed your talk on Lewis, which I thought was interesting. C.S. Lewis. But I'm somewhat curious how familiar you are, or how much you've maybe dived into the philosophy and thoughts of like a Deweyford or a Cornelius Van Til on the Christian side of presuppositional apologetics, and what your thoughts are as far as its application of revelational epistemology.
I have not.
Okay. So that's fair enough. And is there? I feel that in reading.
Let me just say, I can say,
sorry.
in one sense, I've spent a little bit of time there, but nothing serious. My understanding is that if you take the teleological argument, or the argument from design for the existence of God, say the world is orderly and seemingly designed and constructed, and so the best hypothesis is a certain kind of godlike being necessary to create it. The presuppositionalists are making an epistemological variant on that argument, arguing that we have knowledge that goes through certain processes, and that the best understanding of what grounds that knowledge is a presupposition that there is a godlike being who made us with certain kinds of cognitive faculties. That's as far as I've gone in that. So it strikes me as an analogous argument there.
Okay, fair enough. I was just more curious about you yourself in this sort of this journey into philosophy. It seems as though you have a fondness for religion in some regard, or at least respect. And I'm just somewhat curious how that comes into play with your philosophical approaches.
Yeah. Well, I'm an atheist, so I'm not religious, but I think religion, like philosophy, is a complex phenomenon, and there are as many types of religion as there are types of philosophy. And so I would say, 80 or 90% of philosophies, I think, are wrong. Because they make different kinds of assumptions and arguments, and I think the same thing holds on the side of religion. But it's very hard to talk about religion in general, because I don't think that religion is the same thing for everyone. Because I think people come to their religion for different reasons, and it becomes granular very quickly. So if you take, for example, this is not to trivialize, but one of my favorite stories is one of my uncles, who was a Pentecostal preacher, said when I was young, he said, Steve, there's three kinds of Christians. Right? There's Christmas Christians, there's Good Friday Christians, and there's Easter Monday Christians. And so this was his taxonomy of just the Christian religion. And then if you say, well, what does it mean to be a Christian, a Christmas Christian? You say, well, what that means is that you are a Christian who loves Christmas. And what Christmas is all about is about the birth of our Savior, Jesus Christ. So it's about birth. But it's also about celebration. It's about presents and getting together with people you love. And you have, at least in the Western tradition, this Santa Claus figure who's, very jolly and benevolent and brings gifts and so on. So what you have then is a kind of religion that is a kind of Christianity, but what is really driving it is this benevolence, celebration, birth, and life is good and we should enjoy it. Now, if you then think about Good Friday Christians, well, that's the day that Jesus was crucified. And if you are the kind of Christian for whom this is the deepest thing for you, then what you are into is suffering and death and martyrdom, and in some cases, injustice ruling the natural world and all of the pain and suffering that goes along with that. That this is the heart and soul of your Christianity. That's psychologically what's really driving it for you. And then if you say the Easter Monday, says, well, if you are really responding to Easter Monday, well, what happened on that day was Jesus was found not to be in the tomb, and presumably he had resurrected and had gone on to heaven and was waiting for us in heaven. And if so, you are responding to the message of Easter Monday, then what's really driving you is not fellowship and benevolence and so on at Christmas. It's not really about suffering and martyrdom. What you are really focused on is life after death and some sort of hope for immortality and being able to achieve that. Now, this is just to put a psychological lens on it, but that was to say that already we've got three very different things that we would be saying are Christianity, and Christianity in some sense is all of them. But I don't think psychologically people who are attracted to Christianity are attracted to it for the same reason. Some people are more, there's a wise, benevolent God who created the world and wants us to enjoy it and be in fellowship with him. For others, it's this darker, suffering, martyrdom quest. And for others, it's all about fear of death and hopes for an afterlife. So already you would have to start dividing religion into Christianity into these three subsections and dealing with each of them with different understanding and different strategies. So yes. So if we then start doing all of that kind of taxonomy, I do find myself more or less sympathetic with different forms of religion. And so my first question is not just, oh, you're a religious person, I'm an atheist person, I hate you and you're just wrong and stupid and so forth. I always have to find myself saying, well, what does actually religion mean to you? And the person can give some explanation for what religion means to them. And sometimes, of course, it's an impossible person or a position I can't respect, but lots of them are much more worthy of respect, and so I can engage with those people.
I appreciate it. I really do. I don't want to take the rest of the time here, me being late, and there are a few other questions, but I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm a big fan of your work on postmodernism, so truly, it's a pleasure speaking to you.
Before you go, let's plug a few. Tart, do you know the names of the books that we can plug for him?
I'll put them at the end, and we'll also post them on the YouTube so that they're in the description section, so that we know.
Okay. We did have one question from Brett, and then the second person was Tree. That was way, way back when they were first calling who gets to ask what. So I guess we have you for maybe another 7 or 8 minutes. So
sure. Fire the questions, maybe. That's I think what we're going to have to do, if there's a way we can do that. Is Brett still in the audience? I don't see him.
Yeah, Brett's here.
Brett, go ahead.
Brett, you want to unmute and ask your question real quick, Brett?
Sure, Mr. Hicks. Thank you very much for being here today. I put the question in the chat. It was related earlier to Nietzsche's point on his critique of egalitarianism. I don't know if I consider myself an egalitarian, but I am very concerned about humans dividing into groups, continued warfare, tribalism, fighting into the future. And so I'm just wondering from your perspective, what is a sustainable model for future human civilizations and moving towards higher levels of consciousness where things like war, like maybe they don't ever fully disappear, but they don't become the monetary normal thing of like the military industrial complex type situation?
Yeah,
that's a big question.
That's a very good question. So I think philosophy is so important. We're going to be giving a lecture next month in Tennessee, developing this theme or part of this theme as well. Let me start by making a historical point. The first time in human history, we had a relatively peaceful century. Start this empirically. If you think from 1815 to 1914, that's almost 1 century. And with a few exceptions, and relatively small-scale exceptions, there were no wars between the end of Napoleon and the outbreak of World War I. No wars in Western civilization. And this is striking because here we had the British and the French and the Dutch and the Norwegians and the Spanish who, prior to that time, you look at the history, it's like just war. And then suddenly, these nations are not fighting wars with each other anymore. Another point I'd like to make in this context is I come from Canada originally. We have the longest natural border in the world, or a political border with the United States. The United States and Canada have never gone to war with each other. I have to go back to a conflict in 1812 when Canada was not even a country yet. There was a small-scale war between the British and the Americans. So starting from that as an empirical point, if we're really interested in peace, one natural entree is to say, why is it that all of these countries that for centuries were almost constantly at war with each other were now peaceful? And there were some wars involving, European wars involving Russia, which of course is an old feudal system still at that point, and the Turks, right, and some places over further in the eastern part of Europe. But Western Europe, Northern Europe, North America, peaceful. And here I want to say it's a testament to the power of philosophy, because what had happened in modern philosophy, this is also going to be one of my later critiques of postmodernism that is taking us precisely back into this direction of irrationality, skepticism, group identities, and conflict understanding of human beings, and setting us up for some terrible things in the future. What happened in Western Europe and North America is that all of those nations are Enlightenment philosophy nations. The predominant philosophy of the time came to be a belief in the individual rights, individual tolerance, universality of rights, the idea that human beings are rational beings that can be educated, can learn how to use their very sophisticated cognitive faculties to understand the world, to understand themselves, to become productive, and so to deal with each other socially on a peaceful basis. And it was once those ideas took hold in the 1700s and revolutions were fought, right? The American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, and the first phase of the French Revolution, the battles against treating women as second and third class citizens, the battles against slavery, and say we need to see slaves even as individuals who have their own minds, their own lives, who should be free and self-governing individuals. All of this is happening in the 1700s. Once that philosophy became widespread in the culture and institutionalized, all of the countries that used to be at war with each other started respecting liberty rights, the property rights, the right to life of citizens in other countries as well. And that was the first big era of peacefulness for such a long time in human history. So what I would say then is this issues of postmodernism and where we are right now, and we're in second or third generation postmodernism, so it's being applied in various aspects, it's philosophically interesting, but philosophy, when it gets put into practice, has real life differences. And one, I think, very important lesson is, if philosophically we're able to justify claims that human beings are in fact individuals, that they have agency, including cognitive agency and moral agency, and that if they are free, and if we have certain institutional protections, individual rights to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, tolerance for our differences, a commitment to finding mutually beneficial or win-win relationships, if we have that philosophy and we can make it compelling, then we can have an era of peace. Otherwise, we are setting ourselves up for a relapse into the disasters and conflicts that have riven much of human history.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer. I hope maybe we can get one more in here if you can. If not, do you think you can get one more question?
Critique.
One more. Okay. Tree, are you there? I'd like to maybe hear from you if you could.
Tree is actually not with us. Oh, wow. Okay, there you are. Awesome.
Hi.
Ta-da!
So, I was wondering about...
Tree, you're a little quiet. Tree, you're a little quiet there.
Okay. Looks like...
So, yeah, sorry, we've only got him for about 2 more minutes.
Sorry. 2 seconds.
I can hear.
Yeah.
Go for it. Now I can hear.
Like emergent phenomena. So, like, if
Now,
you have
I can hear now.
Okay. If you have an emergent phenomenon that is causing a negative effect, right? So you have a lot of people who are not doing immoral actions individually, but together their actions as a whole produce a negative impact that if one person were to cause, you would consider that action immoral. How do you judge the moral responsibility?
I think I would need some examples first of the individuals individually are not doing anything, but somehow emergently there is something positive that is happening. Right now, I'm drawing.
So a number of individuals enter a public space. By enough people going into that public space, they create danger because there's a fire code violation, right? That is not being enforced by the lack of owner, I guess.
Right. So in a way, it's kind of overloading the commons in that particular case. So it's safe up to a certain point, but there's a threshold point. Well, my quick answer then would have to be you would have to have some sort of property rights agency that has control over that space that you were talking about. Part of their responsibility, if they're going to open it to the public, is to determine what is the appropriate number of people in that case, and then just find some way to enforce the appropriate number of people. So that's not to deny that the problem can't exist, but give a property rights solution to it.
If that does not occur, then who is responsible morally for that lack of?
Well, I think, in that case, we do have a problem of, partly a problem of knowledge and partly a problem of incentives, because I think this is just a redescription of the problem. If it's an attractive space and lots of people want to go there, then they're incentivized to go there. They don't have an incentive not to go there, but also they're not aware of the overcrowding problem individually. So first, we would have to say the solution would require that each of us, to the extent that we are going into unregulated commonses, bear an individual responsibility to ask what the critical capacity of that commons is going to be, and be on the outlook for being willing to withdraw from it if it seems irresponsible in some sense.
If it occurs regularly, does that mean humans are bad by our nature?
I think it would depend on why it is occurring regularly, and I think at this point we would need to get to specific cases. So I don't know if there's. The example I'm going to is like a rave club where you've got young people, they love to dance, they love music, they love being with lots of other people. But if there is a hot new rave club, it's going to attract a huge number of people, and the risks of danger in a number of different ways are going to increase. So how then do we solve that problem, given that we are dealing with people in their teens and 20s with a certain kind of psychology? And I wouldn't want to say right off the bat that they are bad people. Partly at that point, I want to say, well, they're just teenagers, or they're just people in their 20s, and I can sort of remember what that used to mean. Maybe at that point, we would say whoever is initiating the rave does bear some responsibility. Whoever is saying this is going to be the space, whoever is sending the messages out by text or social media or whatever, if they are taking the initiative, with that initiative comes some responsibility for the space. And if they are aware there is a common problem and they need, as part of their responsibility, to take steps to deal with that problem, if they are continuing to say, do that, hosting and setting up the space for the rave and not bothering and to do the research about what the potential dangers are, then there would be a negligence case that could be made, and some sort of tort cases would probably have to work their way through the system to figure out how best to handle those situations. And I think that's the best I can do in a very short period of time.
We really appreciate your time. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and come on like this. I know it was some of these questions were a little impromptu. We really appreciate you taking a couple extra minutes there at the end. I'll give you the rest of your day. It was a real treat.
A lot of territory. Yeah.
It was a real treat.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. For everyone else who decides to stay with us, feel free to keep on we can keep the conversation going here. We're also trying to get Kane B should be coming on here shortly to.
Should be. I sorry guys, I haven't received word back from KMD. It's possible that there could be a scheduling issue, but I very much doubt it. I just sent him a message with the link, so we should be seeing him here soon. And if not, we'll figure something out. We'll have it. We'll still continue the show for a little while. How's that sound?
Yeah, we'll just keep it going
until
he gets here. I was really hoping. What I was really hoping was going to happen was that KMD was going to pop in somewhere along the line, closer to the end, and be able to have some interaction with him. It was so awesome to see Dr. Hicks' interaction with perspective philosophy. So I'm really hopeful that when KMD gets here, we can have a chat and see what his thoughts are. I don't know if he has any thoughts on Stephen Hicks or not. What did you guys think of the show? That was that was really awesome.
No, I mean, Hicks is based.
I followed every bit of it, and I loved it, and I agreed with 99.9% of what he was saying about everything he was talking about, especially with the phenomenon and the noumena and Kant's interpretations, appearances, and perspective philosophy brought up a lot of really good stuff that I wanted to hear too. So that was excellent.
Yeah, a big issue for me is that it didn't seem like he really cashed out how his sort of ethical sentences obtain truth. I think instead he made a kind of semantical argument. When he was talking about the hawk pursuing a rabbit, he cashed it out as essentially that the rabbit appears to be a material benefit for the material system of the hawk. And that's going to be face value justification, not for calling it moral to eat the rabbit, but for using moral language to talk about your goals regarding consumption of the rabbit. So I thought that his view kind of implied that the material needs of the agent are the sufficient condition under his naturalistic view for that proposition to obtain in truth or falsity. And I wanted to ask him what he thought about normative ethical notions that could be held as true or false that are wholly unconcerned with material needs.
Anybody who wants to respond, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that would have been an interesting talk. I think perspective philosophy had something he was trying to say. I didn't want to interrupt him.
Oh, no, it's all right. I mean, I think that's basically it. I think that there isn't, I was actually, when I timed out, I actually sent a message to Tart as well, saying I didn't want to continue, because, obviously, it could have kept going on for, indefinitely, and I didn't want to take up everyone else's time. But, one of the things that I'm sort of mentioned when I was talking to him was this, how does this sort of a priori conceptual relationship impact our conception of reality? So, and I think when you're saying in terms of this observation of our material interests, sort of directly being the way in which he's cashing out his moral statements, so you could just go the hawk needs the rabbit. It depends on what you even mean by in the sort of semantic sense, need or want. In the first place, in the sense that you could actually go, well, wait a minute, what I'm actually seeing here is an indication of what is already a prescription or a function.
Yeah.
And that's where you would find someone like an Aristotelian or someone like McIntyre who would go, okay, yeah, there is this function, but it does contain this normative component. And so you're going to need to kind of go into okay, well, how is that normativity relating to reality, and how do we know that we are correctly describing and understanding what is this moral function within reality? And I think it's very clear when you say that what happens when this is not necessarily materially observable. So someone might be, let's say, in emotional distress or have some sort of psychological issue that you might be able to observe simply through material sort of material relations, but very well might have a moral, might have some sort of moral purport. But yeah, I think that comes down to how we would answer that. And I think the point that I was really specifically sort of wanting to hone in on was, well, if that is the case, then what is the self? Because the self that he seems to advocate for in the Randian sense is this idea of a particular self, where the self that an Aristotelian would advocate for is a member of a species. And if you're a member of a species, and you're saying that, okay, well, everyone, I know what a hawk wants, because hawks want, in relation to the biology and the sort of species essence, if you will, quote unquote, of what it means to be a hawk. Well, you're going to say the same thing about a human, in which case it doesn't relate to Randian egoism anymore. It relates more to something which is of a more abstract degree, where you start talking about the good of man or the good of good of our society. And I want to see how you'd answer that. But I think it's one of those things where how do you it's, unless you want to go on for another 2.5 hours, there has to be a point when you just go, okay, I see what you're saying. Maybe next time.
Right.
With normativity, it's always that way, it seems.
Well, with just the notion of free will, because I operate under libertarianism. I have an upcoming debate regarding whether or not it is sensible to hold people accountable under a deterministic framework. And I take under libertarianism that we have agency when we're able to deliberate about outcomes expressed as options, where I could have chosen something else, but I deliberated about it and I used my agentic will, influenced by, say, stance-independent facts like my biology in order to make a choice, right? And so I would be curious as to whether or not he's operating under a sort of libertarian view or maybe some sort of determinist framework, because I would argue that it's not good or bad really for like a machine, if you will, to do its function. I don't think that's what's generally meant when we say that things are good or bad. I don't think we're saying that a system that is designed to work a certain way is working the proper way.
I think that's bang on, but I think we also have to call into question about this idea of absolute stance independence, right? Like when you say that the system's operating in the way it's supposed to operate, what you're doing is you're pointing towards that there is a specific way it's supposed to operate, not just that it is continuing to operate in the way in which you are describing. Because otherwise, there'd be no such reason to engage in moral description, because every description would be de facto the moral standard. So as long as you could describe it, you say it is operating, and that is how it should operate, and it is operating, and that's how it. So what you have to do is go, actually, no, there is a point in which I could say the machine is wrong in how it's operating. So the machine is in fact there is a form of how the machine should operate, which is a prescriptive, which is a prescription. And I think that's what I was, when we're doing this consideration, you have to be able to sort of relate it to okay, so you have this description of reality, but where's your prescription of reality? And I think you kind of hit it bang on in the sense that, well, where's it going to come from? Well, it's going to come from your own desire, right? It's going to come from the fact that there is something in you that, if the world isn't right, you're going to engage with that world and feel discontent. And if it wasn't for that discontent or that resistance within you, then the idea of having even an accurate description of the world might very well fall apart. And that's, the Aristotelian point. All men desire to know.
Yeah, so in some sense, right, I think Hicks kind of alienates the mind in some funky ways, but he does definitely affirm that we can come to know it. And I think he even, I wanted to ask him whether he thinks we can know the subject, like you were getting at earlier, the self. He believes that we're going to be able to come up, at some point, scientifically, a sort of account of the subject. Right. But I think that there is a necessary distance, a lack of proximity that we have to the subject that is required to kind of understand it in any sort of meaningful way. I think it would be sort of bleak in some sense to have a one-to-one correspondent causal account of this sort of robust self that we all experience. And so I would be genuinely curious if he thinks that the self is something that will be truly understood and just sort of a hard science sort of outlook. So, but yeah, thanks for addressing those concerns, PP.
No, that's all right. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I wonder if there's some sort of aspect of what the aesthetic appearance of an idea is and what we're likely to believe that comes into play when it comes to any kind of moral philosophy. And the idea that something is bleak as well might be a factor in why hard determinism doesn't tend to impact all that greatly on any of our legal systems. But I'm really curious about when you were saying perspective philosophy, the idea of desire is the foundation of our belief about what's good for the eagle. Would you class that as moral realism in that point? Well,
yeah, I would. This is the issue with Hegel, right? Because Hegel's, he's hard to read, but Hegel's all about dichotomies, and he's all about this idea of like something like subjective and objective. And what he really wants to point out is that in many ways these dichotomies are false. Like this hard distinction between the subjective and objective is false. But not so much that he would go like a postmodernist might say, like, or an existentialist. well, maybe not existentialist, but maybe he's like someone who's more, I guess, more of an anti-realist in the contemporary sense, especially online. It was more likely to go, well, everything is stance independent. It depends upon maybe my own sort of underlying subjective attitudes and dispositions. No, like he certainly wouldn't go like all in on that. He would definitely reject that, to the point in which he would actually go, well, actually the foundations of those attitudes and the foundations of those of the structure of you is in relation to an objective world which has produced you. And the way in which you engage with reality is such that you actually think there is an objective world, that you need to think there is an objective world, that there are genuine wants and desires that if they are not fulfilled, you will necessarily feel the result of that, even if you weren't aware of those wants and desires in the first place. So there are things that even if you are like, that would be quote unquote stance independent, that will impact you. But the only way you're going to know them is through a stance. And this is where you get like someone like, like Jacques Lacan, and this idea of the truth is structured like a lie. It's not that there is, we have to think of that it's either fiction or it's fact. It's that it's only through fiction that we gain the fact of the scenario, that it is the structure and underlying epistemological way in which we engage with a reality which is seeking to resist us. It's seeking to sort of alienate us from this idea of, from this unmediated experience where we go, okay, it has nothing to do with the way I want reality to be. It is completely and absolutely objective of what I wish is the case, but at the same time is necessarily what actually is. And this is where the subject is born out of.